Fellow time travellers, how the devil are you all? It's terrific to have you with me. You're wonderful people, one and all, and the ideal travelling companions for this voyage through space and time. What do we do here? I should know. We explore the past, we contemplate the past to see if there are lessons there that we might apply to the present and to the future. It's really about as simple as that. Many recurrent themes, including the perpetual cyclical rise and fall of the powerful, the charismatic, the demagogic, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Those who, one way or another, move the people around them in one direction or another. This episode is no different. It's about those kinds of people. In this instance, Chandragupta and Ashoka and the Mauryan Dynasty. Those might be unfamiliar names to many, but what they set out to do and what happens in the end will be familiar because, there's nothing new under the sun. Before we get started though, just a quick reminder that you could set about my patreon.com site by supporting this series via patreon.com. You make it all possible, and there's exclusive content, there's early access to content. You'll be sharing the love, and I'd love to see you there. Okay, it's now time to strap into the time machine as we set off towards the next stop in my love letter to the world. So cue the music. Bursts of hopeful light are soon swallowed again by the ever-present, ever-patient dark. Born into obscurity and sold into servitude, found asleep and spared by a fierce lion, ever driving himself always forwards, building, conquering, and seeking to change society. A mighty empire was born and a dynasty set in place. Violence, brutality, and slaughter led to repentance, as pragmatic tolerance, unification, and order were sought within chaos. Endeavouring to understand history in hopes of illuminating the future, I'm Neil Oliver, and this is my love letter to the world.
Morning, Neil. In the last episode, you took us to ancient Greece as its civilization was flowering and simultaneously ripping itself apart with war. Where are we this week?
Hi, Paul. We're leaving Greece. Our point of departure, I suppose, is Greece, and we travel in the company of one of the ancient world's great, but probably by now and for most people, little-known historians. And we're travelling from that part of the world that we know as Greece into the subcontinent, what would become India. We're here as a self-made man rises to power, founding the Mauryan Dynasty and shining a brief burst of light. We're back in the subcontinent, India. There are many people now, in the generations since the Second World War who are connected to the subcontinent. But for the majority of the population living in Britain, India is a faraway place. The subcontinent is a faraway and mysterious place. We often don't really even register how big it is, just as a geographical entity, how strange it is. Because of the way it hangs down like an inverted triangle off part of Asia into the Indian Ocean, it has an unexpected climate. The way that the monsoons and the climate affect that subcontinent are not necessarily what would be expected given its position on the globe. India has been different from the beginning. Long ago, the bits and pieces of Hinduism and the caste system came together to create something really that transcends ideas of nation or state. India is and always has been most affected by Hinduism, It has worked in concert with the people and the populations to create an entity that has a gravitational pull. It holds itself together, and people have come in from the outside. Other cultures, other populations, other religions have come in from outside, but never to the extent that they've really fundamentally changed India. It keeps on digesting everything that comes into it. And so for most of us in the West, without those connections to the subcontinent, it's a place of mystery. It was unaffected by the West for the longest time. There was so much going on. From time to time, whatever was happening in India was affecting about a quarter of the population alive in the world. And they weren't really bothered about what was happening in Europe. Far from it. The outside influences that they were experiencing, Europe and our concerns mattered to India not a jot. Especially now, we're more and more polarised in the West. People are being driven, pushed to define themselves in terms of groups. Everything's about black and white, or good and bad, or left and right. And identity politics have fairly got us by the throat now, so that we're not encouraged to think of ourselves first and foremost as sovereign individuals, but as avatars, representatives of groups that are determined by race, by gender and religion, increasingly and perversely, and in a way that I don't see how it helps. But differences are declared as more defining than anything that might transcend groups and offer unity. We're being encouraged to think of ourselves as being the members of groups that have less and less in common with one another. And it's a strange way to go about things, really, because any meaningful research demonstrates again and again and again that there are more differences within groups than there are between groups. That's just a fact. If you define a group as women and another group as men, there are fewer differences between the groups than there are within the groups. So to constantly be being driven to separate and atomise and see ourselves not as people but as somehow the sum total of our various racial and physical and sexual characteristics, I don't know why that's supposed to help anybody. The way in which we're being driven into smaller and smaller groups, more and more isolated one from another, has been pushed on populations before. And in many ways, it's just interesting to note that from time to time, and usually only briefly, there have been attempts at something else in other places. And one of those attempts takes us to India at this point, for another moment in the story of the world. Somewhere around 300 BC, that's think about that as the time frame that we're in today. 300 years before the birth of Christ, a character called Megasthenes, there's a name which is surely unfamiliar to most. Some will have heard of Megasthenes. He was a Greek historian and writer. I say historian. His writings were strange and have been dismissed by subsequent writers as fantasy. Nonetheless, he was a Greek historian, and he was sent to India. He was sent on a mission that lasted years, a fantastic odyssey of a journey. He was sent on this mission by Seleucus I Nicator. Part of that word Nicator is Nike, that idea of victory. Nike shoes, victory. There's the etymological roots there. Seleucus I Nicator was one of the generals in Alexander the Great's army. When Alexander the Great died, the various generals that were left behind, they sorted out for themselves the divvying up of his empire. Ptolemy got Egypt, for example. Well, Seleucus inherited a big chunk of Western Asia. Now, Alexander and his army, he got to India, but he got no further than that part of it that we would know as the Punjab, in the northwest. So he kind of got just over the doorway, just over the sill into India. But his army refused to go any further for all sorts of reasons, exhaustion being not the least of them. But Megasthenes, who was sent into India by one of the successors to Alexander the Great, Seleucus, he reached all the way to Bengal and into Orissa in the east, So rather than just being stuck in the northwest, he got all the way across and into the eastern part of the subcontinent. And fascinating character, Megasthenes. He encountered, let's say, all sorts of people, all sorts of different tribes and cultural microcosms. And he came up with a book called Indica, Indika. It's gone now. There are no copies of Indica. But it was widely quoted after his time by other writers. And so, although we don't have the book itself, we can piece a lot of it together by what was quoted subsequently by other writers. And it was a very strange place that he described. He described encountering people who had feet that pointed backwards with 8 toes on each foot. And he described people that instead of legs, they walked on snakes. You know, they had snakes coming down from their hip bones and they walked on them. And he talked about whole tribes that didn't eat and lived by breathing in smells. So it's probably a reflection of something that's eternal, really, but it probably reflects, by the standards of his time, the way in which isolated groups react with suspicion to outsiders and the ideas that they build up about people that they don't really know, have maybe just had the merest encounters with, and by a process of Chinese whispers, by the time their description of them has passed through many people, it can come out as all kind of strangeness. So by the time Megasthenes was asking people about the neighbours, he would be getting all sorts of strange descriptions as a result of that. He was sent into India soon after Seleucus had signed a treaty with an Indian king called Chandragupta. So, you know, that's the context. There's been some sort of agreement reached, some sort of diplomacy has taken place, and there's some sort of agreement of cooperation between Seleucus and Chandragupta. And Chandragupta is the founder of the Mauryan Dynasty. And here's where we come to the moment. It exists in the realm of folklore and tradition more than anything else. It would be very hard to say that this is fact that's coming at you now, but folklore and tradition ought not to be dismissed, because things that last, ideas that are passed down through generations, however fanciful they might sound to us, you have to respect the fact that the ideas within them have been deemed important enough generation after generation to sustain, to keep being remembered. So it's always important to pay attention to memories that last, whatever they are and however unbelievable they might sound, because you have to allow for there having been a reason, or there still being a reason why the memory persists. So in the moment that matters, if you like, Chandragupta, according to the folklore, had a meeting. He met, when he was a youngster, Alexander the Great. In the aftermath, he had a dream. Chandragupta dreamt that he was licked all over by a lion. He was in the grip of a lion that, rather than doing him any harm, just licked him all over with its big rough tongue. And Chandragupta awoke as a relative youngster from this dream, transformed. The Chandragupta that went to sleep was quite different psychologically from the Chandragupta that woke up after the dream. And what the dream did to him was persuade him, convince him that he was destined for greatness. We know that Chandragupta was an individual who came from obscurity and poverty, but drove himself to the highest levels. That's really how he did it matters less, or why he did it matters less as well, than the fact that he did do it. He transformed himself from someone obscure to someone who founded an empire. Okay, so give the devil his due. We're around 300 BC, and from the 6th century BC, so from about 300 years earlier, there was a kingdom in part of the subcontinent called Magadha. It'd been there a long time. By 321 BC, Chandragupta, post-dream, now with his sense of self, raised an army and overthrew the king of Magadha. And upon the foundations of Magadha, he raised the Mauryan Empire. So the backstory to the creation of the Mauryan Empire is the transformation of Chandragupta from poor boy, licked by lion in dream, to someone who thinks that there are no limits on his potential. And the reality is that he becomes the founder of the Mauryan Empire. And it spread in his lifetime to take in both the Indus and the Ganges valleys. So they're on opposite sides, east and west, of the widest part of the Indian subcontinent. And it also his empire took in Afghanistan and parts of what we would know as Pakistan and Iran. So a very considerable territory. This was the India of Megasthenes. This was the India that Megasthenes wrote about in Indica. And here's why it matters in the story of the world. The Mauryan Empire was that attempt that we were talking about at the beginning of this, to do something different. Rather than just do the same old divisive, polarising stuff. The Mauryan Empire, under Chandragupta and his successors, saw an attempt to try and alter the India of the caste system. The India that Chandragupta inherited, in a sense, was one dominated on the one hand by the Brahmin priests of the Hindu tradition. Obviously, by then, Buddhism was in the Indian subcontinent. The Buddha was born and lived 500-600 years BC, so Buddhism was established there as well. The caste system that has shaped the destinies of billions of people by now, it was already in place. It was well established. That was the India that Chandragupta inherited. But nonetheless, there was this attempt made to do something different, which it wasn't Chandragupta's, but he set the ball rolling by pulling together as much of the empire as he did, because obviously you can't do something collective and inclusive until you've got the whole place pulled together. That part of it is what happened under Chandragupta. He was succeeded by his son Bindusar, about whom less is known. He may have carried out a lot of the work of expanding the Mauryan Empire into the south, gradually working down the inverted pyramid. If he didn't, that was certainly achieved under his son Ashoka, who put the hand of the Mauryan Empire right across the subcontinent. The India of Megasthenes is unreliable. It's fanciful, and it's a mixture of fact and fiction and hearsay and all the rest of it. But by the time we get to the Mauryan Empire under Ashoka, it's being written about by other writers from other creeds and from other places. So we have more credible stuff about Ashoka's Mauryan Empire than we have about Chandragupta's. And what we do know is that by around the middle years of the 3rd century BC, Ashoka was in the habit of having his ideas, his philosophy, his rules for the operation of society inscribed on natural bedrock and on stone columns all across the empire, so that people had access to a unifying way of thinking. Okay, a bit like the stele of Hammurabi that we talked about right at the very beginning of the story of the world in 100 moments. Here were words, all coming from one source, that began to give people the opportunity to come together. Ashoka is interesting in many ways. He'd converted to Buddhism, away from the Hinduism of his birth. He had become a Buddhist, but part of his expansion of his empire took in the conquest of Orissa in the east, and it definitely involved a terrible slaughter. He put men, women and children to the sword, and in the aftermath of that he repented, and in fact almost in a kind of Damascene moment he decided that violence was unacceptable, and he turned his back on violent ways ever after. So it was in the aftermath of Orissa and turning to peaceable ways that he started sending out his edicts and his ideals that started to appear all over the place so that people could see them. One of the words that has been applied to Ashoka's way of thinking is dharma. It's one of those words, and this is almost more fascinating than anything else. It has no ideal translation into English. You have to come from that Indian culture to get dharma. It has within it, though, ideas about there being a natural way of things, almost like an invisible river that's flowing through the universe. And you can either go with the flow of that invisible torrent, or you can try and swim against it or across it. But clearly the message is that the easiest way is to swim with it and be carried. Don't go against the grain, go with the grain, go with the way of nature. And obviously that sounds a bit like the way, the Tao Te Ching that we've already talked about, that idea of there being a way, natural, that existed before us and that will be there long after we are gone. And you can either go with it and make your life easier, or you can go against it and take the consequences. So Dharma is one of the ways of describing the philosophy of Ashoka. And within it, key to it was tolerance, especially tolerance of religion, which may in many ways have been a reflection of pragmatism on the part of Ashoka, because his empire, although he was notionally in control of this vast landmass that is the subcontinent, or a large part thereof, he did not have what you would call the state capacity to rule it in any meaningful way. He didn't have the communications and the roads and the networks really to pull it all together. So it may have been pragmatic to get in ahead of rebellion and say, broadly speaking, you can kind of do what you like. There's probably a sensible, wise pragmatism about it. It definitely wasn't all benevolent. I mean, don't get the idea that Ashoka was some kind of hippie, all peace and love. There was a secret police force. There were officials who were keeping an eye, watching, spying, ears to the ground, snitching and feeding back into a central point. There was also a bureaucracy, pen pushers who were collecting tax. That's what state bureaucracy always does. And the tax was being collected, though, to pay for large-scale projects. Irrigation, on large-scale irrigation, things that would have been beyond the reach of individual communities, that needed, national investment. Also, quite charmingly in a way, he saw to the planting of endless avenues of banyan trees along the roads, specifically to provide shade for travellers. So that people making vast distances could walk or ride in the shade. It's that moment of coming from Chandragupta with his dream, which enables him or empowers him or inspires him to create the Mauryan Empire, and his grandson Ashoka embarks on this experiment, this wild experiment of religious tolerance, live and let live, Dharma, following the irresistible river of the universe. And you could say that it was an attempt by him to bring order out of chaos. That kind of laissez-faire tolerance enabled a kind of gentle, natural order to establish itself. And it was achieved by letting people be. He famously, one of his lines, one of his quotable quotes is, "All men are my children." So that he was seeing himself in that paternal sense, that whoever they were, whatever colour they were, whatever they believed, whatever their religion, it was fine by him. They were all his children. As we said at the top, it's not normal to embark on something like that. Tolerance seldom lasts. And his vision did not outlive him. It's always the way, it's so often the way that for as long as one person, one strong, committed individual is there at the top of the triangle, they can exert a positive force. But after he was gone, that gravitational pull, that centre, was gone, and the whole thing kind of fell apart like a sandcastle drying out under the relentless Indian sun. And caste and Brahmin Hinduism were just too deeply embedded. They were there in the DNA of the subcontinent by that point, and without Ashoka, the next empire or dynasty that arose was Brahmin. So after Ashoka, Brahmin Hinduism came back in. I have it as a moment. I have that as a moment because unifying ideas based on tolerance, based on Dharma, they never last. They're like butterflies' wings. They might be beautiful, but they're fragile. And bursts of hopeful light are soon swallowed again by the ever-present, ever-patient dark.
It's fascinating how that long ago the cultures were trying to get to grips with each other and learn about each other. You don't think of them sort of travelling around the world and bonding and finding out.
I know. It's difficult to know, isn't it? Was it the case that you just, now and again, the individuals like Herodotus or Homer or Megasthenes, are these just individuals who are by nature curious, and it's them who persuade or find a way to, get a Seleucus to okay and maybe finance a personal mission? Who knows whose idea Megasthenes' journey actually was? Did Seleucus send him, or was Megasthenes determined to do it and just sought the sponsorship of the most obvious bag of money? It's difficult to know, but yes, undoubtedly there have always been attempts to send people on fact-finding missions, find out more, and bring back the news. We're used to that happening instantaneously. Someone shoots a TikTok video on their phone across 30 seconds, and nanoseconds later it's there for everyone to see all over the planet. You go back to 300 BC, things took years. But it's useful to be reminded that even without technology, these things were possible. In the love letter to the British Isles, talked about the Amesbury archer, an individual who was born somewhere south of the Pyrenees but ended up living out the latter part of his life in the southwest of England. Now, he must have walked. So although these attempts to find out more and to go, they would have taken longer, they possibly don't take as long as you think. If you're determined to walk from Calais to the subcontinent, well, you could. You need a bit of luck. You need to avoid accident and, the attentions of nefarious types. But hypothetically, it's just a matter of putting one foot in front of the other. You can walk around the world. We can acquire information from far-off places instantaneously. But yes, there have always been those that are curious and set out to see what was over the horizon, and then came back and wrote books about it, and those books were disseminated and circulated, and the information spread. It's the same process, it just takes longer.
It's just great that it's an ongoing thing that we always, as humans, do. And we're curious.
And as I said at the top, it just remains the case that most of us don't know very much about the wider world. We just don't. And, if you were to stop 100 people in the street and say, tell me something about India 300 years before the birth of Christ, most people are going to struggle with that. So the paradox is that although we've got access now at our fingertips to the sum total of human knowledge in phones in our pockets, most of us can't join up the dots. I was inspired in part to do the story of the world in 100 moments because something my wife Trudy often said. We'd be watching something on television, something factual, a documentary. Let's say it was about, I don't know, Tudor England. And Trudy would say, what do you think was happening in Africa then? And I'm not sure. I would really have to think. Even though we've got access to all the information that a human being could want, when you actually stop to think, when you actually try and join up the dots, that's what the story of the world in 100 moments is all about. It's an attempt to join some dots that spread across 5,000 years. How do you make sense of 5,000 years of world history? Well, to some extent you can't, because too much has happened for any one person to get a grip of. But this is just my attempt to join some dots, that's all. Following their own path, cut off and separated, adapting, settling, developing and evolving over a huge landmass, art, religion, ritual and civilizations developed. Human sacrifice, a preoccupation with death, And great thinkers developed calendars and a grasp that time has no beginning and no end. Next time in my love letter to the world. To help support this podcast and to get access to new and exclusive history and comment vodcasts every week, sign up to my Neil Oliver Patreon site. It would be great to see you there. Check out the Instagram account called Neil Oliver Love Letter, my YouTube channel simply called The Neil Oliver Channel. And to help build this podcast, tell your friends about it, get them listening, and maybe write a review to convince the online crowd to join us. For further reading about these moments in time, you could try my book. It's called The Story of the World in 100 Moments, and it's published by Transworld. Neil Oliver's Love Letter to the World is produced by Paul Ratcliffe and Neil Oliver for Catnip Inc. Music is composed by Milo McKinnon. Social media and YouTube producer is Oscar, CFR. Additional research is by Evie, Lucian, Archie and Teddy. Finance is by Catherine and Trudy. Post-production is by Althorpe Studios, and the graphics are by Paul Plowman. Thanks for listening. This has been a Catnip Inc. Podcasts production.